Some secrets are weapons, some are wounds. The most dangerous one is the secret nobody chooses to use. He held her ruin in an open hand and never closed his fingers. We begin this story now. The boardroom on the 31st floor smelled of cold coffee and colder ambition, and Hermione Granger sat at the head of the table as though the chair had been carved to the precise shape of her spine. 11 men. She had counted them on the way in, the way she always counted, not from fear, but the opposite. Knowing the number of a room was the first act of owning it. 11 men in suits that cost more than the houses they'd grown up in, and every one of them watching her with the particular impatience of people unused to being kept waiting by a woman half their age. "The acquisition fails," she said, "on page 40. A rustle of paper. The senior partner across from her, a silver-haired man named Aldridge, whose handshake had tried, that morning, to be a contest, flipped pages with a thumb gone suddenly clumsy. "There's nothing wrong with page 40. There's an indemnity clause buried in a schedule that isn't cross-referenced anywhere in the body of the agreement." She did not raise her voice. She had learned, long ago, that volume was what people reached for when they had already lost. "If you sign this, you inherit a liability your own lawyers didn't read. I read it. Last night. Twice." Silence has a texture, and she had spent years learning to read it the way other people read faces. This silence was the grain of old leather, yielding, reluctant, hers. "You're certain," Aldridge said. Not a question. A man lowering a flag. "I am never anything else." That was the line they paid her for. That was the reputation. Granger reads the room before the room knows it's being read. And it had made her, by 30, the consultant that the careful and the frightened called when the numbers stopped being numbers and started being knives. In 6 years, she had not once been seen to flinch. Not when a client wept. Not when a deal worth 9 figures cracked open at 3 in the morning. Not anyone could have told you, ever. She gathered her papers. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, a small ceremony of departure. At the door, she paused only to straighten a single sheet that did not need straightening, and then she was gone, heels striking the marble in a rhythm as even as a heartbeat. In the lift, she let her shoulders drop 1/2 inch. That was all. That was the whole of what she permitted herself, descending 31 floors through a glass tube above a city that did not know her name, and did not know the other one either. The flat she kept in the Muggle world had nothing of magic in it that a guest could find. The wand lived in a drawer she rarely opened. The photographs did not move. She had chosen this on purpose, every careful, ordinary thing of it, the way a woman chooses a country to be exiled in. She did not think about why anymore. The thinking was finished. The war had ended, and the people had cheered her name in a square, and some of them, that same season, had spat a word at her in the street that she still carried on the inside of her left forearm, cut there in a handwriting she would know in the dark. Mud blood. It had healed badly. Cursed silver did not care about healing. She wore long sleeves the way other women wore perfume, habitually, completely, until the habit became the self. The magical world had crowned her and marked her in the same breath. So she had simply walked out of it, into a world that judged her by her mind, and only her mind. And there she had built something no one could take. Control. That was the word for it, when she let herself use a word at all. By day, it wore a tailored jacket and read the schedules nobody else read. And by night, it wore something else entirely, in rooms with no windows, where powerful men paid handsomely for the rarest thing money could buy them, the experience of not being in charge. The club had no name on its door, only a black lacquered number and a brass bell that did not ring. You came because you had been told. You came, the ones who came, because somewhere under the importance and the wealth, there was a part of them that had never once in their adult lives been told no, and meant it. And they would pay anything at all to feel the floor of themselves again. Hermione gave them that. She never touched what she did not choose to touch. She set every term, named every limit, held every thread. There was no surrender in it for her. That was the whole architecture of the thing, the elegance of it. She had spent 1 year of her life utterly at the mercy of other people's cruelty, screaming on a drawing-room floor while a woman carved a slur into her skin. She had decided, somewhere in the long aftermath, that she would never again be in a room where the power was not hers. So she became the room. They called her by a name that was not Hermione. The men who knelt knew nothing of a war, of a forest, of a time-turner or a slur, or a girl who had once cried in a castle bathroom over a boy who didn't see her. They knew only the line of her, the cool, unhurried voice, the absolute and unbreakable certainty that here, behind the unmarked door, she decided everything. It was the safest she ever felt. That was the part no one would have believed. The night it broke open was an ordinary night. A new member, vetted and vouched for, that was the only way anyone came, was to be brought through to observe before participating, the discreet way these things were done. She did not, as a rule, take much interest in the faces. They blurred, the men, into a single composite of need and money and shame. She was crossing the low-lit landing between rooms, gloved to the elbow, her own face arranged into the serene, immovable mask that was the truest thing she owned, when she heard a voice in the dim below speaking to the woman who kept the door. Just a few words, a drawl, dry as struck flint, asking some bland question about the house. Nothing in the words at all. But the voice went into her like cold water down the spine. She had not heard that voice in 6 years, and her body knew it before her mind would consent to. Some buried, animal part of her catalogued it instantly. The lazy patrician downstroke at the ends of words, the boredom worn like armour over something that had never once been boredom. And her gloved hand found the banister and gripped it, and the leather creaked. No, it cannot be. There are 1,000 cold-voiced men in this city. She told herself this even as her feet carried her, against every instinct of self-preservation, 3 steps down toward the light, where the men at the door turned at the sound. And she looked at him, and he looked at her. Draco Malfoy stood in the amber pool of the single lamp, pale as he had ever been, older now in a way that had nothing to do with years. A good coat, a careful stillness, the loose elegance of a man who had learned to move through the world without taking up its attention. The years had thinned the cruelty out of his face and left something quieter and harder to name. He had been mid-sentence. the sentence died. She watched the recognition arrive in him the way a tide arrives, not all at once, but in a horrifying, unstoppable rising. His grey eyes moved over the gloves, the height of her in those heels, the room behind her, and came back to her face, and changed. The whole of her life, both halves of it, balanced in that one corridor of silence. She had a name here that was not her own. She had a reputation in another world built entirely on the fact that no one had ever seen her undone. She had a scar under that long black glove that no living person had been permitted to look at. And every single one of those things, every wall she had spent 6 years setting stone on careful stone, stood in the path of the recognition opening across Draco Malfoy's face. Her mind, the mind they paid fortunes for, the mind that read the room before the room knew it was being read. Her mind, for the first time in 6 years, gave her nothing at all. No clause to cite, no schedule to flip to, no cool, flat sentence to end the conversation and walk away. There was only the static rising in the air between the landing and the lamp, only the ozone-sharp awareness that the floor of her carefully built world had just tilted under her, only the grey eyes that had found her in the one place on earth she could not afford to be found. Neither of them moved, neither of them breathed. And then, slowly, with the ghost of something at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile and was very far from kindness, Draco Malfoy tilted his head a single degree to one side, the way a man does when he has just been handed something he was not expecting, and finds that he cannot for the life of him decide what it is worth. She did not run. That was the discipline of years, and it held her now the way a frozen rope holds a climber over a drop, taut, screaming, but holding. Every fibre of her wanted to turn on the stair and vanish into the dark of the upper rooms, to put doors and silence and the whole architecture of her second life between herself and those grey eyes. The wanting was so strong it had a taste, copper and cold at the back of her tongue. She did not move toward it. She moved toward him. This, too, she had learned. The thing you fear becomes a master the moment you give it your back. So Hermione Granger came down the last 3 steps into the amber light, with her chin level and her gloved hands loose at her sides, and she did not let the woman at the door see anything at all cross her face, because nothing did. Marlene. Her voice was the same voice that had buried the acquisition on page 40, unhurried, certain, the temperature of still water. Show our guest to the green room. I'll take him myself. He's been recommended to me personally. A lie, clean and total. Marlene, who knew better than to question the house's mistress, inclined her head and withdrew into the dim. And then there was no one in the small lamplit hall but the 2 of them, 6 years, and 1 war and 100 unsaid things standing in the warm, narrow air between. Personally, Draco said. He turned the word over the way a jeweller turns a stone to the light, looking for the flaw. How fortunate for me. Walk. He walked. That was the first surprise, and she filed it away with the cold precision that was the marrow of her. He obeyed, though she understood it for what it was, even as it happened. He was not yielding. He was curious. He was a man who had just discovered a door in a wall where no door should be, and he wanted to see the room behind it before he decided whether to wall it up again or walk through. She led him down a corridor lit by candles in iron sconces, real flame, because the men who came here paid for the old expensive theatre of it, the scent of beeswax, and the way shadows breathed on the walls. Her heels struck the dark floorboards in that even, unhurried rhythm. Behind her, his footfalls made almost no sound at all. He had always moved like that. Even as a boy, he had moved like something that did not want to be heard until it had already arrived. The green room was small, walled in dark silk, a single low lamp, 2 chairs that faced each other across a distance she had measured years ago to the inch, close enough to feel the heat of another body, far enough that no one could pretend the closeness was an accident. She had built every room in this house around the management of distance. She gestured him to the far chair and took the near one and crossed one black-gloved wrist over the other in her lap and looked at him. He did not sit. Of course, he did not sit. He stood by the chair with one hand resting on its back and let his gaze travel the room. The silk, the lamp, the gloves, the woman, and she let him look, because letting him look was its own kind of command. I am not afraid of your eyes. Spend them. Granger, he said at last, very softly, as if testing whether the name would shatter something. Hermione Granger. Sit down. I think not. The ghost at the corner of his mouth again. I think, for once in either of our lives, I'll stand. There it was, the shape of the thing he believed he held. She watched it move behind his eyes, the calculation, the slow, appalling arithmetic of what is this worth. And she understood with perfect clarity that the next several minutes would decide the next several years of her life. Perhaps all of them. So she did the one thing he could not have braced for. She did not plead. She did not threaten. She leaned back into the chair, settled into it the way a queen settles, and let a silence open in the room that she had no intention of being the one to close. It cost him. She saw it. Cost him. He had come down a stair into a secret, and he had expected, surely, the satisfaction of watching her squirm. The famous Granger, the war heroine, the impossible, insufferable girl who had been right about everything, caught in a room she could never explain. He had expected leverage to feel like leverage. And instead, she sat in front of him perfectly composed and made him hold the weight of it. And the longer the quiet stretched, the more it became plain that the weight was heavier than he had thought. You're not going to ask me, he said finally. Ask you what? What I want. His knuckles had gone white where they gripped the chair back. He saw her notice and let go of it, and slid both hands into his pockets with a carelessness that fooled neither of them. What it will take. Everyone asks. It's the first thing the cornered ask. I'm not cornered. No? He took a step. The candle shadows shifted on the silk. You have a name in there that isn't yours. You have a life, this, all of this, that not one soul in our world has the smallest idea of. Granger the brilliant, Granger the brave, Granger who wrote half the laws they live by now. His voice dropped, not unkind, which was somehow worse than cruelty. And I walked into it by accident on a Tuesday. Yes, she said. You did. She held his eyes. And now you're standing in my house, in a room I built, having been led here by me, having walked where I told you to walk and stopped where I told you to stop. Tell me again which of us is cornered. The flame guttered between them. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and something in his face that she had no name for moved, and was gone, there and gone like a fish under dark water. And she felt, against every instinct she owned, a thin, sharp thread of something that was not fear at all. "I could ruin you," he said, quietly, almost wonderingly, as though he were informing himself of the fact rather than her. "You could try." She let the smallest edge come into it, the edge she used on men who mistook her stillness for softness. "You'd find it costs more than you think to ruin a woman who has already decided she will not be ruined. And you'd find—" She rose now, unhurried, until they stood very nearly of a height, the lamp throwing both their shadows long and tangled up the silk wall. "That I have spent 6 years learning exactly how to take a thing meant to destroy me and wear it like armor instead. I'm rather good at it. I had a great deal of practice young." She did not touch her left sleeve. She never touched it, but something in the way she did not touch it drew his eyes there for half a heartbeat, and she watched him almost understand, and was furious at herself for the lapse, and let none of the fury reach her face. So she took up the glove at her right wrist and smoothed it, one slow pass, the bite of the seam against her skin the only thing in the room that was entirely hers. "You know my secret, Malfoy. The question that should be keeping you awake is not what you can do to me with it. It's why I'm not the least bit frightened that you know." His jaw worked. The drawl, when it came, had lost an inch of its lacquer. "Maybe you should be. Maybe." She moved past him to the door, close enough that the air between their shoulders went taut and humming, close enough to feel the warmth come off him, and she did not slow, and she did not flinch, and her voice as she passed was almost gentle. "But you've been here a quarter of an hour, and you haven't named a price." "A blackmailer names his price in the first minute. He can't help it. The wanting's too strong." She opened the door onto the candlelit corridor. "You haven't asked me for anything at all. I find that far more interesting than anything you could threaten." He turned. The lamplight caught the side of his face, and for one unguarded instant, the boredom and the cruelty and the calculation all fell away from it, and what was left underneath was so plainly, simply lost. A man holding a thing he did not understand how to hold, that she had to look away from it, because looking at it did something to the careful, even rhythm of her own pulse that she did not like and could not afford. "I don't know what I want," Draco Malfoy said, and the honesty of it landed in the corridor like a struck bell, ringing, ugly, true. "That's the trouble. I've been standing here trying to decide, and I haven't the faintest idea." And there it was, the thing she had not let herself name, the thing that changed the whole shape of the danger. She could manage a man who wanted something. She had built a life, 2 lives, on the management of men who wanted things. Wanting was a lever. Wanting was a leash. Give her a man with a price, and she would have him handled before the candle burned an inch lower. But a man who held her ruin in his open hand and could not, would not, did not know how to close his fingers around it, that she had no idea at all how to manage. She stood in the doorway with the candle flame leaning toward them both in some small draught, and she looked at Draco Malfoy looking at her, and for the first time in 6 careful, armoured, immaculate years, Hermione Granger had not the smallest notion of what was going to happen next, and found, to her own cold horror, that some traitor part of her did not want to walk away from the not knowing. He did not come back to the house. That was its own kind of torment, and Hermione recognized it as torment only on the fourth night, when she found herself glancing at the unmarked door between clients and despising the glance the instant she caught it. She had spent the better part of a week braced for him, for the next move, the letter, the quiet word in a corridor that would name at last the thing he wanted. She knew how to meet a move. A move had a shape. You stepped into it and turned it back. What she did not know how to meet was the silence, and Draco Malfoy gave her nothing else. So she did what she always did with a problem she could not solve by waiting. She went looking for it. It was almost laughably easy to find him once she let herself look. The wizarding press had largely lost interest in the Malfoy name. There was no scandal left in it, only the dull ache of disgrace gone cold. But the Muggle financial pages, those she read every morning with her coffee, and the name was there if you knew the shell it hid behind. A holding company, old money moving quietly out of the world that had broken it and into the world that did not know to care. He had done, she realized, almost exactly what she had done. He had walked out of the country that crowned and marked its people and built a fortress in the one next door. She had not expected to find that they had chosen the same exile. She liked it even less than she would have liked finding him a monster. A monster she could have managed. The conference room on the 19th floor of a glass tower in the city was not a place she would have chosen to see him again. It was too bright, too ordinary, too full of other people. And that was precisely why the universe, which she had long ago stopped trusting, arranged it so. She had been engaged by a Muggle firm to vet the structure of a cross-border acquisition. She arrived early, as she always did, took the seat at the head of the table that her reputation reserved for her without anyone ever needing to say so, and opened her folder. And the door opened, and the principals on the other side of the deal filed in, and the last of them, unhurried, in a charcoal coat too well cut for the room, with the loose elegance of a man who had learned to move through the world without taking up its attention, was Draco Malfoy. She did not drop the pen. Years held her hand steady on the pen. But the room, which she had owned 3 seconds before, was suddenly a room she did not own at all, because there were now 2 people in it who knew that the woman at the head of the table had a second name and a windowless house, and a scar she let no one see. He stopped just inside the door. The recognition crossed his face and was mastered almost as fast as hers. Almost, but she saw the half-beat where it cost him and was savagely glad of it. They were, at least, evenly matched in this. 2 people who had each spent 6 years learning to be unreadable, sitting down across a table to read each other. "Ms. Granger," said the lead Muggle banker, oblivious, gesturing between them. "This is one of our counterparts on the buy side, Mr. Malfoy. I believe you'll find him." "We're acquainted," Hermione said. A beat. "Distantly," Draco said, and sat. The deal, after that, became a stage on which neither of them performed for the audience that thought it was the audience. The Muggle bankers spoke of multiples and indemnities and the architecture of debt, and Hermione answered them in the cool exact register that had made her name. And across the table, Draco Malfoy listened with his pale eyes half-lidded and said almost nothing, and every silent minute of it was a conversation neither table could hear. "You came to find me," his stillness said. "You disappeared," her flat, clear sentences about warranty caps said back. "You held my whole life in your hand, and then you simply walked away with it. What kind of blackmailer does that? The kind who hasn't decided what he is." His single raised eyebrow answered when she cited a clause he had clearly also read and clearly also understood, because he was, it turned out, very good at this. Better than the men around him, sharper, quieter, his mind moving the way hers moved, 2 moves ahead of the room. She had not expected that either. She had braced for the boy who sneered. She had not braced for the man who, when the lead banker proposed a structure that buried a risk 3 layers down, looked at her across the table for the first time in 20 minutes and said mildly, "I think Ms. Granger has already seen the problem with that. Page 60, the cross default." It was page 60. It was the cross default. He had read it the way she had read it, the way no one else in the room had read it, and he had handed her the moment instead of taking it, set it down in front of her like a card laid face up, and she understood it for what it was, not a surrender, an offering. "Look, we are the same animal. We see the same things in the dark." She did not thank him. She picked up the moment and used it and buried the structure on page 60, and the deal bent the way she made it bend, and across the table Draco Malfoy watched her work with an expression she had to keep refusing to name. When it broke for the afternoon, the others spilled out toward coffee and telephones, and she gathered her papers in the slow, deliberate ceremony that was her armor, and did not look up until the room had emptied of everyone but the 2 of them, and the low hum of the building's cold air. "You're good at this," he said. He had not risen. He sat at an angle to the table, one ankle over a knee, watching her with that quiet that unsettled her more than noise ever had. Better than the press ever made you sound. They always made you sound like a swat. They never said you were dangerous. And you've nothing to say about the rest of it. She squared the edges of her folder, the seam of her glove. She wore gloves even here. Thin grey leather no one questioned, because the alternative was a sleeve that might ride up, bit against the inside of her wrist as she pressed the papers flat. 5 days, Malfoy. You found the one thing in my life I would pay anything to keep buried, and you've done nothing with it. You haven't asked me for a single thing. You haven't even threatened me again. You sat across a table from me for 3 hours and helped me close a deal. She lifted her eyes to his and let the question come out flat and hard. Why? For a long moment he didn't answer. The light off the glass tower opposite moved on the side of his face. And then he did something she had not seen him do. Not as a boy, not 5 nights ago in the candlelit room. He looked, briefly, away from her, as though the answer was somewhere outside the window and not in him at all. Because the moment I use it, he said, I become exactly what everyone has always believed I am. His voice was very level, very quiet, scrubbed clean of the drawl. And I have spent 6 years. He stopped. His jaw worked once. He did not finish the sentence, and she understood with a sudden clarity that he was not going to, that this man did not make speeches about what he had ruined or what he carried, that his guilt did not live in words at all. It lived in the things he would not say, and the levers he would not pull, and the moment on page 60 when he had handed her a weapon instead of using it on her. He stood. He did up the single button of the charcoal coat. "I'm not going to ruin you, Granger," he said. "You can stop bracing for it. I just—" Again the small fracture, the sentence abandoned at the edge. "I haven't worked out what I'm doing instead. That's all." He came around the table to leave, and the room was narrow, and the path to the door took him close to where she stood with her folder pressed to her chest. And for one moment they were near enough that she could see the war in the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, near enough that the cool air carried the faint, clean scent of him, cedar and something underneath it sharper, near enough that her own pulse betrayed her in her throat. She did not step back. She never stepped back. And he did not step around her with the wide, careful berth she expected. He stopped. They stood a hand's breadth apart in the empty glass room, neither of them moving, the whole of the unspoken thing standing up in the air between them like a charge before lightning. His eyes went, just once, to her mouth and came back up, and she watched him master it, watched the want close over, the way the lid closes over a flame, and she did not know. She who knew everything, who read every room, whether she was furious that he had mastered it or grateful, and the not knowing was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her. His hand rose, half an inch, toward her, toward the folder she clutched, or her wrist, or the air beside her face. She would never afterward be certain which, because the door at the far end opened and the lead banker's voice came in ahead of him, bright and oblivious, asking whether they'd settled the question of the escrow. Draco's hand dropped. The mask came down over his face like a portcullis. "After you, Miss Granger," he said, in the dry, distant voice of a man she had never met, and stood aside to let her pass. And she walked out into the bright, ordinary corridor with her heart slamming against the cage of her perfect composure, knowing that something had very nearly happened in that room, and that the only thing more frightening than its almost happening was how much, in the secret place beneath all her armour, she had wanted it not to be interrupted at all. The deal kept them in each other's orbit for 3 weeks, and 3 weeks was long enough for the bracing to become something else. She noticed it first in small failures of her own discipline. The way she began, without deciding to take the seat at the conference table that faced the door he would come through. The way her morning reading of the financial pages had quietly reorganized itself around his name. The way she found herself, once, in the middle of an unrelated meeting, recalling the exact pitch of his voice when he had said, "I haven't worked out what I'm doing instead," and losing, for a full second, the thread of what she was being paid a fortune to attend to. That second appalled her. She had not lost a thread in 6 years. She straightened the cuff of a sleeve that did not need straightening and dragged herself back into the room by main force. He was, in his way, no steadier. She could read it now, having watched him for hours across the long tables, the small tells under the lacquer, the way his thumb worried at the silver signet ring he wore, turning it and turning it when the talk dragged, the cold metal catching the light. The way he had stopped, somewhere in the second week, bothering to pretend he was looking at the documents when she spoke. He looked at her instead, openly, not with the calculation of a man weighing a secret. With something quieter and more dangerous, the look of a man trying to solve a problem he was no longer sure he wanted solved. Neither of them spoke of the house. The unmarked door stood in the air between every cool professional sentence they exchanged, and they walked around it together, two people stepping with elaborate care around a thing on the floor that neither would name. And then, on a wet Thursday, with the rain coming down the glass in long grey ropes, the lift broke. It was the most ordinary catastrophe imaginable. They had stayed late, the others gone, the deal 3 signatures from done. And they had stepped into the lift together because there was no reason not to. And somewhere between the 19th floor and the street, the cables decided with a lurch and a groan and the sudden death of the lights that they would go no further. Darkness. The emergency lamp came up a moment later, low and amber, and in its dim glow, they stood at opposite walls of a steel box the size of a confessional, with the rain inaudible far above, and the city humming somewhere below, and nowhere at all to look but at each other. "Wonderful," Draco said. She had already pressed the call button. A bored voice through the grill promised an engineer within the hour. An hour. 60 minutes in a box 4 feet wide with the one person on Earth who knew both halves of her, and no table between them, no clauses, no oblivious bankers, nothing at all but the amber light and the small steel room and the unbearable nearness. She did the thing she always did with fear. She turned and faced it. "You could have used it by now," she said. 3 weeks. You've had 100 chances. A word in the right ear. A document left where the wrong person would find it. You've sat next to men who would pay handsomely to know what you know, and you've said nothing. She kept her voice level, but the box was small, and the level voice filled it. "I have spent 3 weeks trying to understand you, Malfoy, and I cannot, and I despise not understanding things. So tell me, plainly, what are you waiting for?" He was quiet a long moment. The amber light caught the silver ring as he turned it. "You want me to be a villain?" he said. "It would be easier for you. A villain you could fight." He looked up. "You've built your whole life around fighting. I've watched you do it for 3 weeks. Every room you walk into, you take it apart before you let it touch you. You did it to me the first night, sat in that chair like a queen, and made me hold my own threat until it got too heavy, and I dropped it." A breath that was almost a laugh, without humour in it. "I haven't used what I know, because the day I walked down that stair and saw you, I understood something I'd rather not have." "And what was that?" "That you and I are the same kind of coward." He said it without cruelty, which was the only way it could have landed as hard as it did. We both ran. You ran into a world that judges you by your mind and lets you keep your sleeves down. I ran into the same world for the same reason, so I could be a man who'd done something instead of a man who was something. We're both hiding in plain sight in a country that doesn't know our names. The only difference is you built something worth admiring, and I just built a wall. His jaw tightened. He looked away at the steel, at the rain dark beyond the box he could not see through. "I'm not going to be the thing that drags you back into the place that hurt you. I worked that out somewhere around the first week. I just couldn't think how to say it without sounding like I wanted something for it. The rain ran down a building they could not see. The box hummed. And Hermione Granger, who had not let a living soul look at her undefended in 6 years, felt the careful, even rhythm of her own breathing go ragged at the edges, because he had just described the exact architecture of her exile, and he had described it from the inside, because he was standing in the same ruin. She did not answer with words. She could not find the words. The mind they paid fortunes for had gone quiet. Instead, and she would spend a long time afterward trying to understand why, she lifted her right hand, slowly, and drew the thin grey glove from it, finger by finger, and let it fall. And then, before her courage could turn and run, she pushed the sleeve of her left arm up to the elbow and held the inside of her forearm to the amber light. The word was there, as it had been there for 6 years, cut into her in a handwriting she would know in the dark. Mud blood. The scar, silver pale and slightly raised. The letters, cruel and exact. The thing she had hidden from clients and lovers and every soul who had ever come near her, held out now in a broken lift to the son of the woman whose sister had carved it. He went very still. She watched him understand. She watched the recognition arrive the way it had arrived on the stair that first night, not all at once, but in a terrible rising. And she watched what it did to his face, which was not what she had braced for. She had braced for the flinch of the guilty, the cheap, quick performance of horror. She got neither. What crossed his face was worse and truer, a stricken, wordless grief, the look of a man seeing in another person's skin the exact measure of the world he had once belonged to and could never fully leave behind. His own family's house, his own family's drawing room. He did not look away from it, and he did not perform. And his guilt, she saw it plainly now, saw the shape of it at last, lived not in any speech, but in the way he could not seem to make himself speak at all. He crossed the small box, one step. He did not ask. He lifted his hand, the one with the silver ring, the cold ring she could feel the faint bite of even before it touched her. And he laid his fingertips against the scar so lightly that it was barely contact at all, the way you might touch something you were afraid was still an open wound. She did not pull away. She, who pulled away from everyone, who had built 2 lives on the inviolability of her own skin, stood in the amber light and let Draco Malfoy touch the worst thing that had ever been done to her. And the touch went through her like the static before lightning, like the whole charged hush of a storm about to break. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words, not a speech. Not "I ruined your life," not any of the melodrama she might have predicted from the boy he'd been. Just the 2 plain words, and his fingertips on the cruel letters, and his grey eyes lifting to hers with the wall finally, completely down. And she understood, standing there with her arm bare and her secret laid open and his hand warm against the cold record of her hurt, that the thing she had handed him was no longer a secret he could use against her. It had become the one true thing another living person knew about her and had survived knowing. The weapon had turned into a bond in the amber dark, and she had no ideas what to do with that, and for the first time in 6 years she did not want to do anything at all except stand exactly where she was and not let go. After the lift, The careful distance they had kept became impossible to keep, and neither of them seemed able to decide whether that was a victory or a wound. The deal closed. The Muggle bankers shook hands and dispersed to their next campaigns, and the professional reason that had bound Hermione and Draco to the same rooms for 3 weeks simply dissolved, the way scaffolding comes down once a building can stand on its own. There was no longer any cause for them to meet. There was every reason in the world for her to let him recede back into the financial pages, and the unmarked door of her old life to close again over the whole impossible episode. She did not let it. Or rather, she discovered she could not, which was a different and more frightening thing. She told herself it was caution. A man who knew her secret was a loose thread, and a loose thread had to be watched. So when the note came, 3 days after the closing, a single line in a hand she did not know was his until she saw it, the letters narrow and exact. There is a thing I should tell you, not by owl. Tonight, if you'll come. She told herself she went because not going was the greater risk, and almost believed it, until she was standing on the wet pavement outside the address he'd given, and her heart was doing something her heart had no professional business doing. It was his flat. She understood that as the door opened. Not a neutral ground, not a restaurant, not the bright, safe glass of a conference room. His own rooms, high above a river of rain-slick streetlight, sparely furnished in the way of a man who had decided long ago not to want things, and warm, a fire in a real grate, because he too, it seemed, paid for the old expensive theatre of flame. The rain came down the tall windows in sheets. The city below was smeared to gold and dark. "You came," he said, and stood aside. "You said you had something to tell me." She crossed the threshold the way she crossed every threshold, owning it, and set her wet coat over the back of a chair, and turned to face him. And the firelight was on his face, and on the silver ring, and on the careful nothing of the room. And the thing she had told herself about caution fell quietly to pieces, because there was no caution in why she'd come, and she knew it now beyond denying. "I lied," he said. "Sit down. No, I'll stand. I do better standing." The ghost of the old joke from the first night, and she almost smiled, and didn't. "There's no thing I have to tell you. There's a thing I have to ask, and I couldn't think how to put it in a note that wouldn't make me sound like exactly the man I've spent 3 weeks promising you I'm not." "Then put it badly," she said. "I'd rather have it badly than not at all." He turned the ring once. The rain ran on the glass. And when he spoke, it was without the drawl, without the lacquer, the most undefended she had ever heard him. "I can't stop," he said. "That's the whole of it. The deal's done. There's no reason on earth for me to see you again, and I've sat in these rooms for 3 days, unable to think of anything but the way you take a room apart, and the way you looked at me in that lift before you—" He stopped. "Before you showed me. I keep thinking I should let you go. It would be the decent thing. You ran from a world that hurt you, and I'm the last face from it you should ever have to see again. And I cannot make myself do it. I've tried. So I'm asking you, plainly the way you wanted it. Tell me to go, and I'll go. Tell me you came here tonight only because I'm a risk you needed to manage, and I'll believe you, and you'll never hear from me again." His eyes came up. But don't lie to me, Granger. You're better at it than anyone alive, and I'm asking you not to. Why did you come? The fire cracked in the grate. Outside, the storm had found its full voice. The rain was a roar now, the windows running silver. And Hermione Granger stood in the warm, firelit room with the question she had refused to ask herself laid bare in front of her by the one person who had ever managed to read her as fast as she read everyone else, and found that the mind they paid fortunes for had no clause to cite, no schedule to flip to, no cool flat sentence to end the conversation and walk away. There was only the truth, and the truth was a country she had not set foot in for 6 years. I came, she said slowly, because for 3 weeks you were the only person in either of my lives who saw all of me and did not try to make me smaller for it. Her voice was not quite level. She heard it not be level and did not try to fix it. Every man who comes to that house wants me to be a thing they can use. Every client wants me to be a mind they can rent. You found the one secret that could have made me yours, and you put it down. You touched the worst thing anyone ever did to me, as though... Now her voice did fail her, and she let it. As though it was something that could still hurt, and not something to be used. Do you have the smallest idea what that is, Malfoy, to a woman who has spent 6 years making certain no one could ever do anything to her again? He took a step. The firelight moved. Tell me, he said softly. It's terrifying. She did not retreat from him. She never retreated. But her hand had risen to the cuff of her sleeve and was pressing the seam flat, that small, frantic ceremony, the bite of the fabric against her wrist, the only thing holding her to the floor. I built 2 whole lives so that the power in every room would be mine. And you walked into both of them, and I cannot find the lever. I cannot manage you. There's nothing you want that I can give you to make this safe. And the worst of it, she made herself say it, the most dangerous sentence she had ever spoken. The worst of it is that I don't want it to be safe. The distance between them was a hand's breadth now. She did not remember closing it. The rain roared on the glass, and the fire threw their shadows tangled up the wall, and the air between them had gone taut and humming, the charge before lightning, the held breath of the whole storming night. His hand rose. Not toward a folder this time, not toward the safe, ambiguous air. He lifted it slowly, giving her every second of every inch to step back, and laid his fingertips against the line of her jaw, the cold silver of the ring a small bright shock against the warmth of her skin, and she did not step back. She who stepped back from everyone. She stood in the firelight and let him, and her breath broke audibly in the quiet between 2 rolls of distant thunder. Hermione, he said. Her own name, the real one, the one no one at the house had ever known, and no client had ever earned. He had never once used it. It undid something in her that 6 years of armor had been built to keep done up. His eyes went to her mouth and stayed there, and this time he did not master it, and she watched the want rise in him unhidden, and felt the answering pull in herself like the ground tilting, like the floor of her careful world going soft. He leaned in, slow, so slow. Slow enough that it was a question and not a taking, his breath warm against her lips, the rain a wall of sound, the firelight gold on the side of his face, the space between their mouths narrowing to nothing, to a hair's breadth, to the last held instant before, The fire spat. A log shifted and broke in the grate with a crack like a snapped wand, and a fan of sparks burst up the chimney throat, and she flinched, not from him, never from him, but the old animal flinch of a body that had learned the hard way to fear sudden sounds, and the spell of the moment shattered on the floor between them. He stilled instantly. His hand stayed at her jaw, but he drew back the half-inch, reading her, always reading her now, and she hated the interruption and was grateful for it in the same breath, because the thing that had nearly happened was so much larger than a kiss. It was the end of 6 years of being inviolable. It was the laying down of every wall at once. And she stood there in the firelight with his hand warm against her face and her own heart slamming, and looked at the want still plain in his eyes and the restraint he was holding it behind for her sake, and understood that she had come to the edge of the one surrender she had sworn she would never make, and that she was no longer certain she wanted to step back from it at all. She left before the kiss could finish what it had started. Not coldly. She made certain of that much in the part of her that was still able to make herself certain of anything. She pressed her palm once to his chest, over the place where his heart was going as hard as hers, and she said, "Not like this. Not tonight." And he let her go without a word of argument, because that too was who he had become. A man who would not take what was not fully given. She gathered her coat from the chair and went out into the storm, and the rain swallowed her, and she walked 12 streets in it before she stopped shaking, and she could not have said whether she was shaking from the cold or from how close she had come to setting down everything she was. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark of the Muggle flat with the rain on the window and the ghost of cold silver still printed against her jaw, and she thought, with a kind of wonder and a kind of terror, I am going to let him in. I am actually going to do it. And the thought did not bring the dread she expected. It brought something perilously like relief. That was Thursday. On Monday, her whole world began to come apart. It started with a question from a place questions never came from. A junior partner at the Muggle firm she most often worked through stopped her in a corridor, pleasant, oblivious, making conversation, and mentioned that a man had been around asking after her, not a client. Someone discreet, someone with the careful manner of an investigator, asking about her hours, her movements, whether anyone knew where Miss Granger went of an evening. Hermione kept her face the temperature of still water, and thanked him and walked on, and turned the corner, and stood for a moment with one gloved hand pressed flat to the cold wall. By Wednesday, it was no longer a question. It was a pattern, a second contact at a second remove. A photograph. She never saw it, only heard of it second-hand from the woman who kept the unmarked door. A photograph of the house's quiet street, of the lacquered number taken from across the road. Someone was building a file. Someone was assembling, with patience and money, the precise architecture of her ruin. The bridge between Granger, the brilliant Muggle consultant, and the woman with the second name behind the door that had no name. The two halves of her life that she had kept apart at the cost of everything, being quietly, expertly drawn together by a hand she could not see. And there was only one person in either world who knew that both halves existed. Only one person who held the thread that joined them. Only one. She did not want to believe it. She made herself examine the not wanting the way she examined everything, and found it inadmissible. The wanting not to believe was exactly the kind of feeling that had ruined sharper minds than hers. She laid the facts out cold on the table of her mind. 6 years, no one had come close. Then Draco Malfoy walked down a stair and learned both her names, and 3 weeks later, a stranger was photographing her door. He had said he would not use it. He had touched her scar and said, "I'm sorry," and nearly kissed her in the firelight and asked her, with the wall down, why she had come. And men, she knew this in her marrow. She had built 2 lives on knowing it. Men said anything at all when the wanting was strong enough, and the strongest lever of all was the one a woman handed you herself in a firelit room with her heart in her open hand. "I cannot manage him," she had told him. "There's nothing you want that I can give you." And perhaps that had been the lie. Perhaps the thing he wanted had never been a price she could pay. Perhaps it had been this: to be, just once, the one who held the power over the girl who had been right about everything, who had been crowned while his family was disgraced, who took every room apart before she would let it touch her. Perhaps the patience itself had been the cruelty. 3 weeks of putting the weapon down so that she would lower her guard far enough to be cut to the bone. The thought was unbearable. She made herself bear it anyway. Bearing the unbearable was the only thing she had ever been reliably good at. He came to her on Thursday, a week to the night from the firelight, because she had stopped answering his notes, and he was not a man who could leave a silence alone any more than she could. She let him in, because the alternative was a scene on a Muggle doorstep, and she had not survived 6 years by making scenes. She did not offer him a chair. She stood in the center of the room with her arms folded and her sleeves down and the gloves on, all of it back, every wall rebuilt overnight, stone on furious, careful stone. "Someone's been asking after you," she said. Flat, no preamble. She watched his face for the tell. "At my firm, on the street outside the house, a man with money and patience, building a file. Photographs of the door. Questions about my evenings." She let the silence open the way she always let it open, and put the whole weight of it on him. 3 weeks ago, no one on earth could have drawn a line between my 2 lives. Then you found both of them. And now someone is drawing the line. So I'll ask you the way you asked me, Malfoy. Plainly, don't lie to me, because I am very, very good at knowing when I'm being lied to. Is it you? The thing she had braced for did not come. He did not protest. He did not perform the wounded innocence of the guilty, the fast, cheap horror. What crossed his face was worse, and she misread it in the worst possible way. Because what crossed his face was not the flinch of a man caught, but the slow grey settling of a man watching a thing he had been afraid of arrive exactly on schedule. He had known, she thought wildly. He had known this moment would come, and that was the proof. That was... "No," he said quietly. "It isn't me." "That's what you'd say either way." "Yes," he agreed. "It is." And he did not argue further, and the not arguing maddened her past bearing, because a man with nothing to hide fought. A man with nothing to hide was wounded and loud. and Draco Malfoy stood in her sitting room and took the accusation the way he had taken everything from the first night, quietly, without grasping, with that terrible stillness. And she could not tell, she who could tell everything, whether the stillness was innocence or the deepest guilt of all. "Get out," she said. Her voice did not shake. She made certain it did not shake. The cost of making certain was enormous, and she paid it and let none of it show. "I let you in. Do you understand what that cost me? I let you touch the one thing. I stood in your rooms and I told you I didn't want to be safe. And a week later, there's a man with a camera outside, the only place on earth I'm free." Her gloved hands had curled to fists at her sides. She felt the seams bite. "You're the only person who could have done this. So whatever this is, whatever you wanted, the satisfaction of it, the watching me come apart, take it and get out, and don't come near either of my lives again." For a long moment, he did not move. The rain had started again, soft against the glass, and the lamp threw his shadow long across her floor. And she watched him absorb each word like a blow he had decided in advance not to dodge. He looked at her. The rebuilt walls, the gloves, the folded arms, the whole armoured fortress of her slammed shut against him. And something in his face that had been open all week, that had touched her scar and said her real name in the firelight, closed over slowly and completely, the portcullis coming down for the last time. He did not defend himself again. He did not name the cost to him of being believed capable of this. His guilt, if it was guilt, and his grief, if it was grief, lived where they had always lived in him, in the things he would not say. He inclined his head a single degree, the same small tilt she had seen on the stair the first night when he had been handed something and could not decide what it was worth. "All right," he said. "Only that." He turned for the door, and his hand was on it, and she stood in the centre of her ruined, careful room, with her heart screaming something her face would not let it say. And at the threshold, he stopped, not to argue, not to plead, but only to speak once more into the rain-soft dark without turning around. "When you find out who it really is," he said, "and you will, because you find out everything, I want you to remember that I had 3 weeks to use what I knew, and the only thing I ever did with it was put it down." And then he opened the door and walked out into the weather and pulled it shut behind him with a soft and final click that landed in the quiet room harder than any slam could have. She found out everything. She always found out everything. That was the curse of the mind they paid fortunes for. It would not let a question alone, even when she would have given a great deal to stop asking. For 2 days, she did not ask. For 2 days, she let herself believe it was Draco, because believing it was Draco was simpler than the alternative. And the alternative, that she had thrown a man out of her life on the strength of a fear rather than a fact, was a kind of failure she had not permitted herself in 6 years. She moved through her work with the cold efficiency that had made her name, and felt, underneath it, the slow, corrosive work of a doubt she could not put down. He had 3 weeks. The only thing he ever did with it was put it down. The sentence followed her into every silent room. It was not the sentence of a guilty man. It was, she finally admitted to herself at 2 in the morning on the 3rd night, Not even the kind of sentence Draco Malfoy was capable of inventing to cover himself. He did not make speeches. He never had. The speeches were hers. So she did the thing she should have done at the start, before fear had spoken in the place where her judgment should have stood. She investigated. It took her 4 days. She was good at it, better than the discreet man with the camera, because she had spent 6 years learning the architecture of her own concealment, and therefore knew, better than anyone alive, exactly where the seams of it could be pried. She traced the man with the camera to the firm that employed him, and the firm to the account that paid it, and the account through 3 careful shells to a name. And when she had the name, she sat very still at her desk for a long time and did not move at all. It was a client, one of the men who came to the house, a powerful, careful man whose pride she had wounded in the small, precise way the house existed to wound it, by holding to a limit he had wanted her to break, and who had decided, in the way of such men, that a woman who would not be controlled in the room must be controlled outside of it. He had set his money and his investigator on the puzzle of who she was by day. He had been at it, she learned, for 2 months. 2 months. It had begun before Draco Malfoy ever walked down that stair. She read the dates twice, 3 times, the way she had once read the indemnity clause on page 40, and the floor of the wrong she had done went out from under her. Whatever was coming for her had been coming before Draco knew either of her names. He had not drawn the line between her 2 lives. The line had already been drawn by another hand weeks before he ever saw her on the landing. And she had stood in her own sitting room and looked at the one person who had been handed her ruin and chosen every single day to set it down. And she had told him to get out and never come near her again. She put her face in her hands, in the empty office, where no one could see, because there was no one to see, because she had spent 6 years making certain there never would be. She went to confront the client. That was the plan, cold and clear. She would handle it the way she handled everything, with the leverage she could always find on a powerful man who had something to lose. She had handled worse. She would unbuild his file the way she had buried the structure on page 60. She arrived to find it already done. The man, she would not afterward be able to think of his name without a peculiar vertigo, received her grey and shaken in a study that smelled of fear sweat under the cigar smoke, and the file was gone. The investigator dismissed, the photographs burned, the whole patient apparatus of her ruin dismantled down to the studs. He did not want to speak of why. She made him. She was very good at making people speak of things they did not want to. What had happened, when she finally drew it out of him, was this. Someone had come to him. A man he would not name at first, out of what looked less like loyalty than fright. A quiet man, the client said, with a continental sort of coldness, who had laid out across this very desk a complete accounting of the client's own affairs. Every leveraged position, every quiet indiscretion, every soft place in an empire that had looked, from the outside, unbreakable. The quiet man had not threatened. He had simply made it understood, in the most courteous terms imaginable, that the file the client was building would be answered, item for item, with files of the client's own, and that the answering had already been arranged and would proceed automatically and could not now be called back the moment any harm came to a certain woman's name. He had asked for nothing. He had taken nothing. He had set the whole thing up so that it ran without him, so that there was no lever left to pull against him, and then he had bid the client good evening and gone out into the rain. What did he look like? Hermione said. She knew. She had known from the word continental, from the word courteous, from the shape of a man who would dismantle a threat and ask for nothing, and arrange matters so cleanly that he himself could never be thanked, because he could never be found at the centre of them. But she made the client say it. Pale, the man said. Fair, a grey coat. He wore a ring, silver, an old crest of some kind. He turned it the whole time he spoke. I remember the ring. She stood in the cigar smoke study, and the room went very far away. He had done it the day she threw him out. He had walked out of her sitting room into the rain, believed by the one person whose belief he had wanted to be the architect of her ruin. And instead of defending himself, instead of clearing his name, instead of doing the one thing that would have made her sorry, he had gone and quietly destroyed the real threat to her and arranged it so that she would never have to know he had done it. He had asked for nothing. He had taken no credit. He had let her go on believing the worst of him rather than burden her with the debt of being saved. His innocence had not lived in any speech. It had lived the way it had always lived in him, in the thing he did in silence and never meant for her to see. She understood, standing there, the whole of it at last. The secret had never been a weapon, because he had never once wanted to win. The power had never been in what he knew. It had been the entire time in the choice he made every single day not to use it. And she had been so busy guarding against the lever that she had not understood. She was looking at a man who had set the lever down the first night and never picked it up again. She found him on the bridge. She had not known where he would be. She had simply walked out of the client's house into the wet dark and let the city carry her. And her feet had taken her to the river, and he was there, as though some last thread between them had not yet been cut. A tall figure in a grey coat at the rail, looking down at the black water moving under the rain. He heard her step and did not turn. He had always known her step. "You found out," he said to the river, not a question. His voice was very tired. It was a client. Her own voice was unsteady, and she let it be unsteady. She was done, she found, with making it level at all costs. He'd been at it 2 months, before you ever... She stopped. The rain ran down her face, and she let it. "It started before you knew my name, Draco. I accused you of a thing that was already happening before you existed in it. And you stood in my room and let me. You let me throw you out, and you never once told me you were innocent. And then you went and..." Her breath broke. "You dismantled the whole of it. You saved everything I am. And you arranged it so I'd never know, so I could go on hating you in peace. Why? Why would you..." He turned then. The rain was on his face too, fair hair dark with it. And he looked at her across the small wet distance with the wall down again, all the way down, undefended in a way that no longer cost him anything to be, because there was nothing left to defend. "Because you needed someone to be the villain," he said. and I was the only one near enough to volunteer. The ghost of the old dryness gone soft. And because the only thing I have ever been able to give you from the first night on that stair is to not use the thing I could have used. It's the only language I had. I couldn't make you believe me, so I... The turn of the ring, the cold silver catching the bridge light. So, I made the danger go away instead, and let you keep your low opinion of me, because at least that way you were safe, and your walls were up, and nobody got to touch you against your will. Not even me. Especially not me. His jaw worked. I'd rather you were safe and hated me than not safe and... He did not finish. He never finished the dangerous ones. But she finished it for herself, standing in the rain, and the finishing of it took the last of the armour she had left and laid it gently down on the wet stones of the bridge, and she crossed the small distance between them without deciding to, the way she had crossed it in the firelight, the way she had been crossing it since the first night, without ever once admitting where her feet were taking her. She stopped a hand's breadth from him, the way she always stopped, on the very edge of the distance she had spent 6 years learning to keep. And then, for the first time in either of her lives, she crossed it. She lifted both hands to his face, bare hands. She had pulled the gloves off somewhere on the long walk through the rain and not noticed doing it. And now her palms were against the cold, wet plains of his cheeks, and she felt him go still under the touch, the way he had gone still in the lift when she bared her arm, the stillness of a man afraid that any movement at all might end the thing he had stopped letting himself want. "You impossible man," she said. Her voice had given up all its careful level. "You could have had anything. You could have had me, the easy way, the cruel way, the way I was braced for from the first night. And instead, you..." The rain ran between her fingers and his skin. 6 years I built 2 whole lives so that no one could ever do anything to me again. And you spent 3 weeks doing the one thing I had no defense against. You did nothing. You wanted nothing. You set it all down, and you kept setting it down, even when I threw you out, even when believing me cost you everything. "It didn't cost me everything," he said quietly. His hands had come up to her wrists, not to pull her away, only to hold, to feel that she was real, that she was here, that the hands on his face were hers. "You were safe. That was the part I wanted kept. I don't want to be safe from you." She heard herself say it for the second time, and this time there was no fire to crack, no log to break the spell, no animal flinch waiting in her to ruin it. There was only the rain and the black river moving under them, and the bridge light gold on the water, and the warmth of him under her cold palms. "I have been safe for 6 years, Draco. Safe is a windowless room with the power all on one side. I am so tired of being the only one who decides everything. I am so tired of never once being reached." Her thumbs moved against his cheekbones. "Reach me." He searched her face for the trap in it. She watched him do it, watched the old reflex rise, the same reflex that lived in her, the lifelong habit of looking for the lever in every offered thing. And then she watched him set that down too, the last thing. She watched him decide to believe her, which she understood was the most dangerous thing either of them had ever done, more dangerous than any secret. Because to believe a person is to hand them the whole of yourself and trust them not to use it. Hermione, he said. Her name again, the real one. And then he stopped speaking because there was nothing left worth saying that the not speaking didn't say better. He kissed her. It was not the firelit almost, the slow burning question that the breaking log had shattered. It was the answer to it. His mouth came down on hers, and her hand slid back into his wet hair, and she rose into it, and the rain fell on them both, and neither of them moved to shelter from it, because for once in either of their armoured lives there was nothing to shelter from. The cold silver of his ring pressed against her jaw as his hand cradled the side of her face. His other arm came around the small of her back and drew her in, and she let herself be drawn. She, who had spent 6 years letting no one move her an inch she had not chosen. She let him pull her against the length of him, and she went. And the going was not surrender, and it was not defeat, because he was not taking. He was asking, with his mouth and his hands, and the whole trembling care of him, the same question he had asked in the firelight. And this time, she answered it with everything the answer had cost her to be ready to give. The static she had spent 3 weeks refusing to name broke at last into something with no edge of danger left in it at all. Only warmth, only the steady, astonishing fact of another person holding her and being held, the magnetic pull that had hummed under every cool professional sentence, finally allowed to close the distance it had been straining across since the first night on the stair. She felt the moment he stopped holding back, felt the kiss deepen and turn from a question into a homecoming. And she made a sound against his mouth that she had never once made in either of her lives. A small broken sound of a wall coming down, and he caught it and gentled it, and did not for one instant try to make it anything but hers. When they finally drew apart, it was only far enough to breathe. He rested his forehead against hers. The rain had soaked them both to the skin, and neither cared. His thumb moved along her cheekbone, slow, wondering, as though he could not quite credit that he was permitted to do it. "I have no idea how to do this," he said against her mouth, and there was the dry ghost of the old Malfoy in it, but warmed all the way through now, the cruelty long since burned out of it. "I built a wall. You said it yourself. I never learned the rest." Neither did I. She was almost laughing, almost weeping, the two so close in her that she could not have told them apart, and she did not try to. "I built too. I'm worse than you." Her fingers tightened in his wet hair. "We'll be terrible at it. We'll both reach for the lever in everything for years. We'll both go cold and armoured at the worst possible moments and have to talk each other back out." "Yes," he said. "I'm not promising you safe," she said. "I can't. I don't know how to be soft, Draco. I forgot. I made certain I forgot. I'll be difficult and watchful, and I'll test every door before I'll walk through it for the rest of my life." "I know." His arm tightened at her back. "I'm not asking for soft. I never was. I'm the last person alive who'd ask you to be less than you are. I've watched you take rooms apart, remember? I'd rather have you difficult and watchful and whole than soft and broken open like everyone else always wanted you." His grey eyes held hers in the rain-gold dark. "I don't want to manage you. I never wanted to win. I just want to be the one you don't have to manage. The one room you can walk into without taking it apart first. And that, not the kiss, not the saving, not any of it. That was the thing that finished the long, slow unbuilding of her, because it was the precise shape of the thing she had stopped letting herself want 6 years ago in a square full of people cheering her name while a slur healed badly on her arm. Not to be adored, not to be protected. Just to be, for once, somewhere she did not have to hold the whole of the power alone, to set it down, half of it, into another pair of hands and trust those hands not to close. "All right," she said. The same 2 words he had given her in her sitting room when she threw him out. And she watched him recognize them, watched them land, watched the last of the grief go out of his face, and something she had no armor against come up to take its place. All right, we'll be terrible at it together. The house with the unmarked door she kept, but on her own terms now, fewer nights, and never again as the only place on earth she was free, because freedom had stopped being a windowless room with a power all on one side. The slur on her arm did not fade. Cursed silver does not care about healing. But she stopped wearing the long sleeves like perfume. She wore them when she chose, and went without them when she chose. And the difference between those two was the whole of what she had been fighting 6 years to win, and had not understood until a pale, difficult man set down a weapon he could have used and asked for nothing in return. The financial pages still carried his shell company name, and hers still went uncarried anywhere the way she liked it. They moved through the same liminal country between 2 worlds, the one that crowned and marked its people, and the one next door that did not know to care. But they moved through it now as 2 and not as 1. And the difference in that was everything. It was raining the morning she finally pulled the wand from the drawer it had lived in for 6 years and set it openly on the desk in his flat beside the silver ring he'd taken off and left there the night before. 2 things laid down. 2 pieces of armor set side by side on the wood, with the rain on the tall windows and the city smeared to gold beneath, and neither of them reaching to pick the pieces back up. He came to stand behind her and put his arms around her and rested his chin on the top of her head, and she leaned back into him the way she had taught herself never to lean into anyone, and they looked together at the small, ordinary miracle of 2 guarded people choosing, at last and on purpose, to be seen. "The grown-up games," she said, "are a great deal harder than the other kind." She felt him smile against her hair. "Good," Draco said. "I never did care for the easy ones." And outside, the rain came down on the bridge and the river and the unmarked door and the whole sleeping city that did not know either of their names. And inside, in the gold lamplight, with the wand and the ring lying quiet between them, they did not need it to. 1 year later, it rained on the morning of the wedding, and neither of them minded at all. It was a small thing, the wedding. They had argued about it for a month. Not the marriage, which neither of them had thought to question once they understood it was coming, but the size of it, the witnesses, how much of 2 worlds they were willing to let into the one room. Hermione had wanted 4 people. Draco had wanted none, which was his old reflex talking, the boy who had learned to move through the world without taking up its attention, and she had recognized the reflex for what it was, and called it by its name, the way they had both learned to do. Now, and in the end, they had settled on a number small enough to count on 2 hands and chosen the river, not the bridge. She had thought about the bridge, the wet stones, the black water, the night she had crossed the last distance and put both bare hands to his cold face. But the bridge belonged to the worst and best night of her life, held together in one place, and she found she did not want to stand on it in a white dress and turn it into something tame. Some places are meant to stay exactly as sharp as they were. So they took a low garden by the same river instead, a stone's throw downstream, where the water ran gold under the same grey light, and they were married there in the rain with no umbrellas, because by now the rain was theirs, and to hide from it would have been a kind of lie. She did not wear long sleeves. That was the thing the 4 guests would not have understood, the thing that meant more to her than the vows. The dress left her forearms bare. The slur was there, as it had been there for 7 years, silver pale and cruel and exact, in a handwriting she would know in the dark. And she stood in the open with it showing, in front of the small handful of people they had let in, and she did not once reach to cover it. She had practiced. Alone, in front of a glass, she had practiced standing with her arms loose at her sides, and her sleeves gone, and her own history written plain on her skin for anyone to read, until the practicing became possible, and then bearable, and then, on the last few mornings, almost nothing at all. Draco saw it the moment she came toward him over the wet grass, and she watched him see it, and she watched what it did to him. Not the stricken grief of the lift, a year gone now, something steadier. He held out his hand for hers and turned it over, gently, the way he had that first night in the dark steel box, and he laid his thumb once across the scar in front of all of them. Not to hide it, not to apologize for it again, but simply to touch it, to say without a word, I see it, I have always seen it, and you are standing here in the rain showing the whole world the worst thing that was ever done to you, and I have never in my life been so proud of anything. The cold silver of the ring caught the grey light. She turned her wrist and closed her bare fingers around his, and that was the first vow, made before either of them said the spoken ones, and it was the truer of the 2. They had not solved each other. That was the part she would have told anyone who asked, if anyone had been able to ask, if there had been a soul alive who knew the whole shape of what they were. People imagined, she suspected, that love was an arrival, that you crossed the last distance and the difficulty ended, the walls came down for good, you were healed. It was not like that. It was not like that at all. There had been the night, 4 months in, when a difficult client had stood too close and used a tone she had spent 6 years learning to make men regret. And she had come home cold and armoured to the teeth. The Queen back in the chair, every door bolted, and she had picked a fight with Draco about nothing, because the fight was easier than the fear. And he had recognized it, because he did the same thing in his own register, going distant and dry and untouchable when the old shames surfaced in him. And instead of fighting back, he had simply waited her out, the way he had waited her out the first night on the stair, until the weight of her own armour got too heavy, and she set it down and told him the true thing underneath, which was that the client had frightened her, and being frightened had frightened her more because she had built 2 whole lives so that she would never be frightened again. There had been the morning he had gone grey and silent over a letter from the world they had both fled, some thin reminder of the name he carried and what the name had done, and he had not spoken of it because he never spoke of it, his guilt living where it had always lived in the things he would not say. And she had not made him speak. She had learned that much. She had only sat down beside him in the cold light and put her hand over his on the table and stayed there, not asking, not fixing, until his thumb stopped turning the silver ring round and went still, and his shoulders came down 1/2 an inch, the same 1/2 inch she allowed herself in the lift on the way down from the 31st floor, the whole of what either of them had ever permitted themselves to show, given now to each other. They reached for the lever in everything. They had warned each other they would in the rain on the bridge a year ago. They both went cold and watchful at the worst possible moments. They both tested every door before they would walk through it. The difference, the whole difference, the thing that made it a marriage and not a siege, was that now there were 2 of them at the doors, and each of them knew the other's locks, and when one went cold, the other had learned, slowly, terribly, with a great deal of getting it wrong, how to talk them back out. It was not safe. She had told him she could not promise him safe, and she had been right. It was something better than safe. It was witnessed. Every cold morning and every armoured night, there was one other person in the room who saw it for what it was, and did not flinch, and did not leave, and did not try to make her smaller. She had stopped, somewhere in the year, being able to remember why she had ever thought safe was the thing worth having. The house with the unmarked door she kept, still, though she went rarely now and on terms that were wholly her own. She had thought she might give it up entirely once she was happy, had assumed, the way the world assumed, that the second self had been a wound dressed up as a kingdom, and that healing would dissolve it. But that was the world's story about her, not hers. The house had never been the wound. The house had been the place she went to be, for once, the one who decided everything, after a year of being a girl on a drawing-room floor who decided nothing at all. It had been hers before Draco, and it stayed hers, and he never once asked her to set it down, because he was the last man alive who would ask her to be less than she was. He had watched her take rooms apart. He liked her dangerous. He had told her so on a wet night a year ago, and he had not changed his mind. That, too, was a kind of vow. I will not ask you to be soft. I will not ask you to be small. I married the woman who buries acquisitions on page 40 and rules a house with no name on its door, and I would not trade one cold, immaculate inch of her for an easier wife. She had married, in her turn, a man who had held her whole ruin in his open hand and never closed his fingers, who had dismantled the real danger in the dark and arranged it so she would never have to know, and let her go on hating him rather than burden her with the debt of being saved. She had married the silence in him, the guilt that lived in deeds and not in speeches, the terrible, patient gentleness of a man who would rather lose her, believing the worst of him, than keep her unsafe for 1 hour. She knew exactly what she had married. She had read him the way she read everything, slowly, completely, over a year of mornings. And she had found no lever and no price and no hidden cruelty waiting under the quiet. And the not finding had stopped frightening her somewhere around the spring. After the vows, the small handful of guests drifted toward the warmth of the house behind them, and for a moment the two of them were left alone by the river in the rain, the way they had been left alone in a conference room, and a broken lift, and a firelit flat, all the rooms in which something had nearly happened, and then, at last, had. He drew her in. The rain ran on them both, and neither moved to shelter from it. His forehead came down against hers, and his bare hand. He had taken to going without gloves too, she had noticed, somewhere in the year, the both of them slowly unlearning the habit of armour against the simple weather of the world. His bare hand cradled the side of her face, the cold ring gone warm now from her skin. "We were terrible at it," he said. The dry ghost of the old Malfoy warmed all the way through. "Just as you promised. We're still terrible at it." She was almost laughing, almost weeping, the two as close in her as they had been on the bridge, and she had stopped, this year, trying to tell them apart. "We'll be terrible at it for 50 years. "Good," Draco said against her mouth, the way he had said it once before in the gold lamplight, with a wand and a ring lying quiet between them. "I never did care for the easy ones." And then he kissed her, slow and certain, in the open, in the rain, with her bare scarred arms going up around his neck, and her real name still warm in the air where he had spoken it during the vows. And the river ran gold beside them, and the grey sky came down soft on the garden, and the whole sleeping country between two worlds did not know either of their names, and did not need to. They had stopped needing it too a long time ago.
Hi, thank you for staying with me until the end. I want to tell you why I wrote this story. I did not want to write about a villain, it would be easy. A man finds a secret, he uses it, he wins. We have seen that 100 times, but I wanted something harder. There is a moment in the story I love the most. They are stuck in a broken lift. It is dark, and Hermione does something she was never done before. She shows him her scar. The worst thing that ever happened to her, and Draco does not use it. He just touches it very softly and says, he is sorry. 2 words, that all. That moment in the whole story for me, because real power is not taking. Real power is when you could take something and you choose not to. Draco had the secret, he had every chance, and every single day he put the weapon down. That is love. Not big words, not promises, just a quiet choice, made again and again. I think a lot of us build walls. We think the walls keep us safe, but Hermione learned something. Safe is lonely. Safe is a room without no window. The brave thing is not the wall. The brave thing is letting one person in. So if you are building walls right now, maybe this story is for you. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart. I'll see you in the next one.